My brother ruined my life, got my wife pregnant, and I found out. After all that, he came crawling back when he found out our parents had left me a $2 million inheritance. My brother made my life a living nightmare. Years later, I discovered he'd gotten my wife pregnant, and the boy I believed was my son wasn't mine after all. Now, after being cut off by our parents and watching me inherit their $2 million fortune, he's crawling back like nothing happened. My younger brother, Caleb, has hated me for as long as I can remember. If you're assuming it was out of jealousy, let me stop you right there. He wasn't the overlooked one, I was. Caleb was always the golden child, so jealousy wasn't something he ever needed to feel. Let me give you a bit more background. Our mom practically worshipped him. She did everything for him, cooked his meals, washed his clothes, and even asked me to help him with his homework. Meanwhile, I was expected to pitch in simply because we were family. Funny how that "we're family" line only seemed to apply when I was doing something for him. I got used to over time. I've always been pretty self-sufficient, so I learned not to expect anything in return. Looking back, maybe I'm partly to blame for making it so easy for him to take without ever giving anything back. Caleb was never around when I needed support. He'd only reach out when he wanted something, and even then, it was never with genuine concern. I was always the quiet one, kept my head down, loved to read, and stay in my own little world. Caleb? He was loud, brash, and basically a younger version of our dad. Complete opposites. I've always been direct, maybe a little too blunt for some people's liking. I never sugarcoated things, and I think that rubbed my mom the wrong way. Over time, I think she started to view me through a negative lens. Whatever the reason, it was clear that Caleb could do no wrong in her eyes. Back then, it didn't really bother me. I thought, fine, let him have the spotlight. But things took a turn when Caleb started actively targeting me. He'd make fun of me constantly. My height, the fact that I wore glasses, anything he could use to tear me down. He even used to sneak into my room to read my journal, then run to mom with whatever he thought would get me in trouble. I'd shout at him, demand he respect my space, and I'd tell my parents, but they'd just laugh. That's how brothers are, they'd say, as if that made it okay. He didn't stop there, either. He nearly broke my glasses once and tampered with my food just to mess with me. One time, he even put tiny rocks in my cereal. Thankfully, I caught them before they cracked my teeth. I told mom about it, and all she said was, "Oh, boys will be boys." That's how siblings bond. Really, Mom? Rocks in my cereal is bonding? Every fight ended the same way, him going straight for my insecurities. He knew exactly where to hit. We went to the same school, and he knew I was being bullied by some of the kids there. Instead of backing me up, he joined in with them. He laughed when they called me names like ugly loser or hairy monkey, and even egged them on to rough me up. To him, I was nothing more than a failure. One time, we had an argument. I can't even remember what sparked it, probably something stupid. But at the end of it, he looked me dead in the eye and told me I should kill myself. Now, most of his jabs I could brush off, but that one cut deep. I was in a dark place back then, really struggling. And hearing those words come from my own brother, that nearly broke me. I've come a long way since, and I'm doing a lot better now, but that moment still stings. Just knowing that your own blood wants you gone, that's a different kind of pain. Our dad was always working, and Mom just didn't seem to care. She even blamed me once, saying I brought it on myself by provoking Caleb. It got worse with time. When we were in high school, he once tried to set my hair on fire. I'm not joking. And you know what Mom said? He was just playing. Seriously, who even thinks that's playing? Trying to burn someone's hair? That's not a prank. That's messed up. Thankfully, my dad finally stepped in and actually sided with me. He told them both they had some serious problems and even threatened to call the cops on Caleb. That moment really shook Caleb. He wasn't used to being called out for anything. Up until then, no one had ever disciplined him for how he treated me. He looked stunned, but my dad kept going. He told Caleb he'd had enough and that it was time he started showing me, his older brother, some respect. Later that day, Dad came into my room to talk. I honestly didn't see it coming. I never thought Dad would take my side, especially since growing up he always told Caleb how alike they were, which, to be fair, was true. But that day, Dad admitted something. He said he'd been waiting for years, hoping Caleb would just grow out of his behavior. that maybe he was just a kid being immature. But now he was realizing Caleb wasn't just immature. He was turning into a straight-up bully. Hearing that from my dad hit me hard, in a good way. I felt seen, like someone finally understood. I almost cried right there. I opened up and told him everything. I shared what Caleb had been doing to me for years, and I even told him about the bullying I was going through at school. My dad looked shocked. I don't think he had any clue how much I was dealing with. The very next day, he went to my school and spoke with the principal to make sure those kids got a clear warning. If they kept messing with me, there'd be real consequences. That same evening, my dad signed me up for MMA at our local gym. He told me I needed to toughen up and start standing up to the people who were pushing me around. I'll admit it probably looked ridiculous at first. Me, this skinny nerd, trying to learn how to fight. But when I get serious about something, I don't give up. I made time for training without letting it mess with my studies. I trained every day, stayed focused, and committed to it fully. And I have to say, it changed me. Not just my body, my whole attitude. Then one day, Caleb did something again. He stole my pocket money. Our parents used to give us money whenever we helped around the house, and I'd been saving mine up for a while. Turns out, Caleb had snuck into my room and taken it. I caught him just as he was about to ride off with his friends. I stopped him and firmly told him to return the money. I reminded him he knew stealing was wrong, but he just laughed and said all I ever did was run to Dad for help. I don't know what snapped at me right then, but I punched him hard, right in the face. He didn't say a word, just fell back and hit the ground. I reached down, pulled him up just enough to grab my money from his pocket, then let go and watched him drop back down. Caleb started bawling like a little kid, loud and dramatic, like he'd just broken a bone or something. It was honestly kind of funny watching him cry like that, especially after all the years he made me feel powerless. But of course, that's when Mom came running out the door. She saw her baby boy on the ground and rushed to help him. Once she found out I'd hit him, she looked stunned and then started scolding me. She told me I should be setting a good example as the older brother, not beating him up. Meanwhile, Caleb just stood there enjoying the whole thing, happy to see me getting blamed. Mom didn't stop there. She went and told Dad that I'd attacked Caleb and that something needed to be done to control me. Dad gave us both a serious look and asked us to explain exactly what happened. I told my dad the truth. Caleb had taken the money I'd worked hard to earn and had been saving for weeks. Caleb, as always, tried to spin it in his favor. He claimed he needed the cash for a date and that, as his brother, I should have just helped him out. But Dad didn't buy it. Instead, he looked him straight in the eye and told him he was lucky I'd only punched him. If it had been anyone else, they probably would have called the cops. He reminded Caleb that taking something without permission is stealing, plain and simple, and that he had no right to touch anyone's belongings. Of course, Caleb didn't like hearing that. He threw a full-blown tantrum, likely hoping our mom would swoop in and take his side. But Dad didn't budge. When Caleb realized that I wasn't going to get punished for hitting him, he exploded, screamed that he hated me, and stormed off to his room, locking the door behind him like some melodramatic kid in a soap opera. After that day, Caleb kept his distance. It was like something finally clicked in his head. He couldn't push me around anymore. Even Dad had stopped entertaining his nonsense. And for the first time in years, I felt like we were standing on equal ground. He never laid a hand on me again after that, but he didn't completely back off either. Whenever our parents weren't around, he'd still find ways to mess with me. Small, nasty things that he thought he could get away with. As he got older, it only got worse. Each year, he seemed angrier, more volatile. His temper was on a hair trigger. If I asked him a simple question, he'd act like I didn't exist, walk right past me while muttering nerd or loser under his breath. And if he actually needed something from me, he refused to ask me directly. He'd go through our mom like we were strangers. I remember asking her once why he couldn't just talk to me himself, and she'd always say the same thing. Try to be more understanding, as if I was the problem. I never knew if this was just him dealing with puberty or if he genuinely hated me. Maybe it was both. For years, I let his words roll off me, but eventually it just got to be too much. I started fantasizing about leaving, just packing up and getting away from him. I asked my mom so many times to help us sit down and actually talk through things as a family, but she always said no. She didn't want to get involved. Even when I asked her why he treated me that way, she just shrugged it off like it was nothing. No explanation, no empathy. Eventually, I got out. I got accepted into my dream university, earned a scholarship thanks to my grades, and finally left home. My dad actually threw a little party to celebrate, and even Mom seemed genuinely proud. Caleb, though, he barely reacted. He was distant, cold, acted like my success meant nothing to him. The day I left for college was a blend of emotions, part excitement for everything ahead, part relief to finally be free from the toxic mess back home. The first few months at university felt like someone had taken a weight off my shoulders. I was finally breathing again. I made new friends, enjoyed my classes, and started to build a life that wasn't tangled up in Caleb's shadow. That constant tension, the fear of being insulted or mocked at every turn, disappeared. I felt lighter, calmer, freer. It was during my second year that I met Karen, my future wife. One of my friends introduced us at a frat party, and we clicked immediately. There was something easy about being with her, like I didn't have to try so hard to be liked. We both came from fairly traditional families, and getting pregnant out of wedlock was a big deal. So when we found out she was expecting in our final year, we didn't wait. As soon as we graduated, we got married. Our wedding was simple but peaceful. No drama, no fights, just a day of quiet happiness. Our parents were supportive, and it honestly felt like a good start. At that time, I really believed I'd found the one. Karen felt like home to me. I'd always wanted a steady, loyal relationship. Just one woman, one life, one future. That was the dream. Even though women had shown interest in me over the years, I never pursued anyone because I was genuinely happy in my marriage. Karen was the woman I had always dreamed of being with, and I never wanted to cause her any pain. But still, despite that, there were 2 times when I found out she'd cheated during our marriage. One of them was an on-and-off affair that lasted a few years with a co-worker of hers who was also married. The other was a fling she had with an ex-boyfriend from high school while she was visiting her family out of town. I know there are people who would probably say I was a fool for staying, and honestly, when I look back now, I can't even argue with that. After separating from her for a while both times, I still ended up choosing to forgive her. A big reason was that I didn't want to raise my child in a broken home, and I really believed that maybe we could get through it. When it happened with her co-worker, we were still young, and I tried to believe it was just one of those careless, immature mistakes. Things seemed to settle down for a while. Even though I was never able to fully trust her again, I tried my hardest to ignore the doubts. I kept reminding myself that if I was going to forgive her, then I had to actually move forward and try to give her marriage a fresh start. It's now been 4 years since that second time she cheated, and I had started to believe I'd made the right decision by giving her another chance. For years after that, Karen seemed like she had truly changed. We were happy again, and we had real plans for the future as a family. But then, 3 months ago, everything came crashing down again. And this time, what she told me was even worse than the first 2 times. She admitted to having been sleeping with someone for a while, and said that our son might not even be mine. The moment those words left her mouth, I felt like the world collapsed under my feet. I was hit with a mix of shock, betrayal, and confusion. I couldn't even begin to wrap my head around what she just told me. In that daze, I asked her why she had kept something like this from me, and how she could possibly do something so painful. Her response was cold, emotionless. It was like none of it mattered to her. She acted distant, like she wasn't affected by what she had just confessed. She didn't give me any clear answers either, just vague responses that left me more lost than before. That moment didn't feel real. I was sitting there trying to understand what had just happened, trying to figure out what was real anymore. I kept asking her to tell me the truth, because after everything, I believed I at least deserved that. I've been raising our son from the very beginning. He was my entire world. And then, finally, she admitted it. She said it was Caleb. My eyes widened, and I asked her what she meant by that. That's when Karen told me everything. She said she and Caleb had gotten close back when I had first introduced her to my family. She had stayed at our place from Thanksgiving through New Year's. I remembered it. Caleb, who was normally distant and cold toward everyone, had actually been nice to her. He was polite and warm, which I thought was a good thing at the time. I'd been glad, honestly. I didn't want Karen to feel like an outsider. She was trying to be part of my family and spent a lot of time with my mom when she could. She had noticed early on that Caleb and I weren't close. She even asked me about it. Eventually, I opened up to Karen about what my childhood had been like with Caleb. I explained the kind of relationship we had, or didn't have, and told her that I honestly didn't think we'd ever be able to fix it. Caleb had never been able to move past whatever he was feeling, and at that point, I didn't think he ever would. Karen said she understood, but that didn't stop her from including Caleb in our plans. Maybe she was hoping we'd eventually start getting along if we spent more time together. Whenever we went out, she'd make sure Caleb was invited. If we were going to watch a movie, she'd ask him to come along. And of course, we'd end up watching whatever movie he picked. I guess during that time, Caleb and I exchanged a few words here and there, which, in all honesty, was a step up from the silent treatment he'd been giving me for years. I do remember Karen and Caleb sitting around, playing video games together. I never thought much of it at the time. Karen once told me that Caleb had opened up to her about some things, his personal struggles, and a recent breakup with his ex-girlfriend. According to her, he was vulnerable, and that led them to build a kind of friendship. Then she told me something I never saw coming. She said that Caleb would flirt with her sometimes, just jokingly, when I wasn't around, and apparently, things escalated from there. One thing led to another, and she said she just couldn't stop herself. I shut my eyes tight. The thought, my wife and my brother, it made my stomach turn. I felt physically sick just imagining it. Karen said she felt consumed by guilt afterward and ran from him. That part actually matched something I remembered. Around that time, she had suddenly told me she wanted to go back home for a while. I'd expected her to stay through New Year's, but she insisted she had to leave. I tried to convince her to stay, but she didn't budge. She left. When we reunited at college after the holiday break, she was back to her cheerful, normal self, so I didn't question anything. I had no idea what had just happened. 2 weeks later, we found out she was pregnant. Now, she told me she had no clue whether the baby was mine or Caleb's. She said there was no way to prove it at the time, and since I was already stepping up and acting like the father, she just went with it. According to her, she chose me because between the two of us, I was the more dependable brother. That was the reason she decided to stay with me, and why we ended up getting married. I felt like my entire life was collapsing. The child I had loved and raised might not even be mine. I asked her if she was still sleeping with Caleb. She didn't say anything at first, but then she gave a slow nod. She admitted that they'd kept in touch all this time. She said their connection was something they couldn't ignore. She told me they'd meet up at hotels. Those times she told me she was working late or had extra shifts, she was actually sneaking away to see him. Then she dropped another truth bomb. Most of those business trips she took were actually just little romantic vacations with Caleb. I asked her why she would even stay married to me if she really wanted to be with my brother. She said she didn't want to be the one who broke up a marriage. And since I'd been such a great father to our son, she had just stayed. She told me it had all been a mistake and that she hadn't known how to stop once it started. I looked at her and told her I was glad she finally told me the truth, and that I was going to pack my things and move out. She broke down crying, begging for forgiveness, telling me I was supposed to scream and yell at her, but instead I was just standing there, calmly planning my next move. I didn't say a word. I walked to the closet, opened the doors, and started packing some of my clothes into a suitcase. In that intense moment, something inside me shifted. I felt a strange but undeniable sense of vindication. After years of enduring Caleb's cruelty and manipulation, the truth had finally come to the surface, and now the tables had turned. It was Caleb who stood exposed, his lies stripped away, his actions out in the open for everyone to see. As he stumbled over his words, trying to explain himself, my dad, usually calm and quiet, couldn't hold back his disappointment. He asked me to hand him the phone, and then he absolutely let Caleb have it. "Caleb," he began, his voice firm and low with anger, "what you've done isn't just betrayal. It's betrayal of your own brother and of this entire family. You slept with your brother's wife, and you kept doing it even after they were married. There are consequences for choices like this," he said. You've shattered the trust we had in you. I raised both of you to value family, loyalty, and basic human decency. And what you've done flies in the face of everything I tried to teach you." Dad paused there, letting the silence hit like a hammer. The way you ignored your brother's feelings, the total disrespect for the marriage he built. You've done damage that can't be undone. You've hurt him, and you've torn apart the very foundation that held this family together. Then he added something that surprised me. "Me and your mom. We feel responsible for how you turned out. But no more. We're done enabling this. Starting today, you're cut off from the college fund. You're on your own now when it comes to your university fees. I'm also done paying for your lifestyle. If you think sleeping with married women makes you a man, let's see what happens when you don't have my money to back you up." As for me, I didn't say much during the call. I kept my composure. I had wanted to scream at Caleb, to lash out, but seeing Dad hold him accountable, that was more satisfying than anything I could have said. For the first time, Caleb's true self had been revealed, and it was clear he never expected to face real consequences. Even then, Caleb kept trying to defend himself. He argued, made excuses, but my dad wasn't having it. He ended the call right then and there, cutting Caleb off mid-sentence. Afterward, my mom walked up to me and wrapped me in a hug. It had been so long since we had shared a moment like that. But in that embrace, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Unspoken support, quiet understanding, and a sense of family that had always been missing. She looked me in the eye and said sorry. She apologized for not believing me all those years. And in that moment, all I could think of was my 14-year-old self. Hurt, dismissed, alone. He never would have imagined this day would come. But here it was. Not long after that, my dad helped me hire a good lawyer so I could finally divorce Karen. She and her lawyer tried to pull every trick in the book, demanding alimony just because I earned more. But thankfully, her affair gave me the upper hand in court. We also went ahead with a paternity test for our son, and that's when the final blow came. The results confirmed it. Caleb was the father. I can't even explain how much that tore me apart. It hurt even more than when Karen confessed to the affair. Finding out that the child I had raised, loved, and bonded with wasn't mine, it made me feel furious and hollow all at once. But somehow I stayed strong. Maybe it was faith, maybe it was survival, maybe it was just sheer will. I didn't collapse. And listen to what happened next, because it only gets more unbelievable from here. Karen begged me to keep visiting my son. She said he didn't deserve to be punished for everything that had happened. But I couldn't do it. I just couldn't bring myself to see him. Every time I looked at him, all I could see was Caleb, and I hated that. Once the divorce was finalized, and I was finally free of that entire mess, I moved into my own place. A bachelor pad. It felt almost unreal, having a space all to myself. I'd gotten married so young that I'd never actually experienced living alone before. But I've always been the independent type, so adjusting didn't take long. Honestly, I grew to love the bachelor lifestyle. About 2 weeks ago, my dad gave me a call. He said he'd been thinking about rewriting his will. He told me he no longer wanted Caleb to receive anything from the estate. Now, one thing you need to know about my dad. When he makes a decision, he sticks to it. No second thoughts. He had made up his mind to completely cut Caleb out of his life, and he followed through. Caleb tried reaching out. He even showed up at our parents' house, begging for their forgiveness, but they wouldn't even let him in. Even my mom, who had always given in to his tantrums, didn't budge this time. I know it must be hurting her deep down, but she, too, seemed to be done with him. The craziest part? Caleb never even once texted me to say sorry. Not a single word, which made it clear he didn't feel guilty about what he'd done. He was only upset about being cut off. That's when my dad told me he was leaving everything to me. He wanted to make sure Caleb couldn't contest a will, so he added a clause. Caleb would get exactly $1. I couldn't believe it. My eyes went wide. I knew how hard my dad had worked all his life. Between his assets, his retirement fund, and the life insurance, it all added up to almost $2 million. The only condition in the will was that if Dad passed before Mom, she'd stay in the house for the rest of her life, even though the property would officially belong to me. Of course, I had no problem with that. I'd gladly care for my mother till her final days. Somehow, Caleb got wind of all this. Since our parents were ignoring him completely, he decided to call me yesterday. He said he wanted to make things right between us. Told me he'd been struggling at college. Ever since Karen learned the child was his, she'd apparently been hounding him for child support. He said he was broke, looking for part-time jobs, and hadn't found anything yet. He practically begged me to talk to the family and help him patch things up. Said he really needed my support. I couldn't help it. I laughed right in his face. I told him I was done. He should have thought all this through before he decided to sleep with my wife and get her pregnant. That's when he started getting defensive, saying I was being unfair and that Karen was to blame, too. I told him I agreed. Karen was at fault. That's exactly why I divorced her. But now she was his problem. So he needed to stop calling me to complain about her or that child, because this was the bed he made. Now he had a lie in it. He tried to raise his voice, but I shut it down. I reminded him that he was no longer the golden boy in the family. He was now the disgrace who'd slept with his own brother's wife. That hit him hard. He started crying, saying that everyone had turned on him. Even our grandparents and relatives had been shaming him, which was true. But at that point, it wasn't my problem anymore. I told him we were finished, that I was done pretending he was still my brother. And then I ended the call. And you won't believe what happened after that. Since that call, I've been replaying the whole conversation over and over in my mind. As much as I hate my brother, I can't deny it. It hit something in me to hear him cry. I don't think I've heard Caleb cry like that since we were kids. I won't pretend it didn't hurt at least a little to hear how helpless he sounded. So I guess that brings me here, wondering if I should speak to our parents about him, or if staying silent makes me a terrible person. Would stepping in help? Or would I just be digging myself back into a hole I finally crawled out of? Update 1. Hey, everyone. A lot of you have been asking why I no longer have any contact with my son, Henry. Some of you have even called me heartless for cutting him off. I understand that this situation sounds cold from the outside, but here's the truth. I just don't feel comfortable raising another man's child. And no, this isn't a classic step-parent situation. I was lied to. I was made to believe Henry was my son, only to later discover he was actually my brother's. I've cried over this for days. Believe me, it broke me. But the biggest reason I've chosen to cut contact is because I no longer want Karen in my life. And I know how this works. If I stay in touch with Henry, Karen will find a way to wedge herself back in. I need my space. You can call me cruel. You can say I'm selfish. But right now, I can't see Henry. Maybe not ever. Or at least, not for a very long time. Update 2. Many of you guessed it. And yes, you were right. It was my mother who told Caleb about my dad's will. And when Caleb had no one else to turn to, that's when he called me. I confronted my mother in front of my dad, and she broke down crying. She said I'd punished Caleb enough and that he had learned his lesson. My dad wasn't having it. He told her flat out that if she truly believed Caleb's betrayal was forgivable, then maybe they shouldn't stay married, because he himself could never forgive what Caleb had done. That threat shut her up right away. He made himself clear. If she ever reached out to Caleb again, and we found out about it, she could pack her things and leave. Like I've said before, my dad is very stubborn. Hopefully, my mom understands that now. And maybe she'll think twice before going behind our backs again. Update 3. All right, I read through everything, and it's been about 5 months since my last update. Things between me and my parents have been a lot better lately. My dad and I go golfing every weekend now. Honestly, he treats me more like a buddy than a son these days. My mom, she still misses Caleb, I can tell, but she's respected the boundary. She's kept her distance. The last I heard about Caleb came from my cousin. Apparently, he'd been begging people for money and eventually had to drop out of college because he couldn't afford the tuition. He's living with Karen now. I've been told he's working part-time as a mechanic. Sounds like he and Karen are raising Henry together. And I guess that's a good thing, in a way. At least they have each other. I never bring up Caleb when I talk to my parents, and they don't bring him up either. It's like there's an unspoken agreement to leave it in the past. As for me, I'm doing pretty well. Got promoted 2 months ago, so my income has improved a lot. I haven't started dating again. I still feel like I need more time, more space to heal. I've been going to therapy recently, just a few sessions so far. Who knows? Maybe it'll help. And you won't believe who reached out to me last week.